Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining today's WebEx presentation. My name is Katie Morris, and I'm with the Department of Medical Assistance Services. Joining me today is Christopher O'Hanley with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Throughout our presentation, please enter all questions into the chat box once again, and we'll answer your questions at the end. All microphones have been muted. Today we will cover the following topics: an overview of the HCBS policy and values, specific issues that have been noted by the review team during the 1.3 process, and how to come into provider organizational compliance, outcomes for providers who do not reach a compliance status, and our next steps for settings validation. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions and answers. Our goal today is to provide specific remediation for providers who remain in a non-compliant or partially compliant status after the review of the 1.3 in REDCap. Our hope is that you understand the specific requirements of a full HCBS policy that DMAS and DBHDF are looking for, as well as an understanding of the systemic and cultural changes that HCBS brings to our waiver system. We hope you log off today knowing what is expected from you as a provider in terms of policy and practice. We're going to begin with a few housekeeping items. We recognize that REDCap is a newer system for providers to navigate, and understanding where your agency is in this process can be a little bit confusing. DMAS has received numerous emails from providers saying that they did not understand why they needed to do a 1.4 assessment because their 1.3 was complete and the circles were green. When you log on to REDCap, you see the general navigation menu to the left-hand side of the screen with the green indicator buttons. These buttons do not indicate compliance. These buttons simply indicate that data has been entered into the field and REDCap could run a report. To find your compliance status, a provider has to log all the way into REDCap and go to their Part 5, which is at the bottom of the navigation button on the left-hand side. At the top of the page on the Part 5, you'll find the assessment date that it was reviewed and a code indicating who the reviewer was. Then you will find a specific rating for each of the questions and very detailed feedback on any areas deemed partially compliant or non-compliant. Once you scroll to the bottom of the page, you will find question 6. This is your compliance status. Again, question 6 in REDCap Part 5 is your compliance status. It's the provider's responsibility to log into REDCap to check their compliance status regularly. REDCap does not send an email once an agency has reached compliance status. Again, there's no email sent when compliance is reached, so a provider must log in and review their Part 5. Throughout today's presentation, we will be referencing all of the resources available on the DMAS HCBS Toolkit, specifically the companion document that was developed before the 1.2 rollout. You can find the companion document in the Organizational Compliance section of the toolkit shown here. Now we're just going to do a brief review of the HCBS Settings rule. In 2014, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid issued the Home and Community-Based Services Final Rule Settings. This came after years of review in various states of how HCBS dollars were being used in the community. CMS found that even when people were living in the community utilizing an HCBS program, their experience was not much different than a person in an institution. Many settings were regimented in all aspects of daily life. People were told when to wake up, eat, who to spend time with, and how much food they could eat. There was no real privacy in the living space. Following this review and sessions with stakeholders for feedback, the final rule was issued. The final rule is a set of very specific protections that individuals who are using HCBS services are entitled to enjoy. Basic tenets include integration and full access into the greater community, the right to privacy, dignity and respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint, optimizing but not regimenting, individual initiative, autonomy, and independence in making life choices, including daily activities, physical environments, and with whom to interact, and facilitating individual choice regarding services and support and who provides them. The final rule also includes a specific emphasis on person-centered planning and self-direction. Lastly, there are specific rights afforded to people who choose to live in provider-owned residential settings. That will be discussed later. Virginia, along with all other states, must be in full compliance with the settings rule by March 17th of 2022. The first step in Virginia's plan is provider organizational compliance. This is the area where you all must obtain compliance in your 1.4 review. It is critical that Virginia closes Phase 1 and moves into specific settings validations. We are on a tight timeline, and your full commitment to this process and philosophy are vital to continue to provide services to Virginians who utilize HCBS waiver services. I will now turn the presentation over to Christopher O'Hanley, who has helped lead the review team of the 1.3 assessment. He will discuss specific trends of noncompliance and how to remediate the issues.
Good morning, and thank you for attending. By far, the most common issue we're seeing in regarding question 2 of REDCap deals with the policy, the HCBS specific policy. A lot of people are still submitting human rights policies and parts of human rights policies, mixing in some HCBS stuff into that, usually in shortened language, and that's not acceptable. The HCBS rights need to be given in their whole state with the specific flow and sections that CMS requires. That document was provided in a number of different examples in the toolkit. Again, they're not interchangeable. You cannot submit your human rights policies as they currently exist in your system. You can take the full HCBS rights policies and attach it in your human rights system as a separate and distinct section of specific rights. But it has to include all of those sections that are in the example documents. This includes the specific list of rights and process for modifications. Modifications to rights is something that many people are forgetting to put in. They'll have every other part of the policy in there, but they're forgetting the modification of rights. And that has to be in your HCBS rights policies, because that says to the regulatory bodies, DMAS and DBHDS, that you understand that there's a path you have to follow. Some people are still using language like rights can be adjusted by contacting the local Human Rights Committee. That's not the process for HCBS rights. HCBS rights start with the person-centered planning process, support coordinator, and the individual. Community inclusion, independence, privacy, and choice are the fabric of the HCBS, and these principles are what separate community-based services from that of an institution. All HCBS policies must also include a section on person-centered planning for ISP development. This is also a required section of the HCBS policy. We have listed all of the sections of the person-centered ISP process that are required. Please take note of the bottom picture on your screen. This is the companion document that is available on HCBS Toolkit. There's a sample policy on the toolkit, and we believe using this as a guide, providers will be able to develop a fully compliant policy. So here you have a view of the person-centered ISP elements as they are listed on the HCBS rights policy. This is the exact wording that CMS issued in their final rule. And this is what we're looking for in your policy. We really don't want providers to shorten the language or change the language in this section, because this is sort of the benchmark of the DD waiver system. Now on your screen, you're going to see the Modification of Rights. This is a very important section because it... Oh, where'd we go? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a page ahead. On your screen, you see the Review of REDCap Section 1.3, provider-owned residential settings have additional rights that apply to their programs. In addition to the general rights, the person-centered planning section of the policy, the residential section, there are additional rights that are afforded to individuals using these services. They include providing a lease or residency agreement that has the same protections afforded in the Virginia Landlord-Tenant Act, ensuring privacy by way of a locked door with a key to their room and a key to the front door, if they so choose, of the house. Freedom to decorate the unit, room, and choice of roommate. Individuals have the freedom and support to control their own schedules and activities and have access to food at any time. I'm going to speak to food at any time. This seems to be one that people want to say they can have one of 3 planned meals whenever they choose to eat it. That's not what this is talking about. This isn't talking about your 3 meals that are made available to people. This means that an individual has the right to choose what food they want to eat and when they want to eat it. So just providing 3 meals is not sufficient in the sense of this requirement. Again, that's one statement. I would not change any of the wording. Individuals are able to have visitors of their choosing at any time. I'll speak to this one as well. A lot of people are shortening this to say individuals can have visitors of their choosing, leaving off the anytime section. That's unacceptable. If an individual wants to have visitors of their choosing at 3 in the morning, that is their right, the same as it's the right of you or I to have visitors in our home at 3 in the morning. And we expect providers to be able to facilitate that. That doesn't mean you can't set parameters around the process by which visitors register at the house and various other things you might do to gather information about visitors' comings and goings. It just means that if you have a resident and they say, look, my mom's getting into town at 2 in the morning and she's coming right over here and we're going to hang out for an hour or so, or she's going to stay overnight in my room with me, you have to be able to accommodate that type of request. So again, this is not something that needs to be changed. Just state it as it's stated, and then if there are exceptions that need to be made for people, those are made on a case-by-case basis. They shouldn't be blanketed throughout your policy. The last one, the setting is physically accessible to the individual, cannot be changed in any way. This is not something that's negotiable, and there are no exceptions allowed for that. So if you have someone in a wheelchair that needs wider doorways, you have to make your setting accessible for that wheelchair once they're in it. So there's just want to be clear on that. That's the one part of all of these settings rules that are not subject to the exceptions rule. All right, we're going to REDCap, Modification of Rights. And this spells out specifically what a provider will do, not may do, but will do if they find the need to adjust any of those residential rights, other than the setting is physically accessible, which cannot be changed. The provider must also include a section on modification to residential rights in their policy. That's this section. These modifications must be documented within the ISP and discussed by the support team at the person-centered planning meeting before they're placed in effect on the individual. This is for just these residential rights. An individual's right to have an accessible home may not be modified. Again, modification of residential rights section must include these elements, and they're all listed there. Identify the specific and individualized assessed needs. So let's use an example. Individual has pica, so they have to have a restriction on their access to food at any time. We would expect that you would have data, a diagnostic criteria, something that specifically shows that need of the individual, and not just that, but a history of the individual having that issue affect their health and safety. That has to be documented. You can't just say that someone has pica, therefore they can't have access to food, because unless you have data that says they've had access to food and it's caused some kind of issue with them, it can't be restricted. There has to be a history of it, and it should be a recent history. So these need to be visited every single year or periodically throughout the year, especially things like where you're taking an individual's right to have a locked door on their room away because they were doing self-harming behavior in their room. If they're also receiving behavioral services for that, which they should be, at some point during that intervention from the behaviorist, that behavior may start to decrease. You should revisit that and think about what we can do to return the lock to their door, to return that level of privacy that the CMS rule says they should have. The changing of the rights follows this process. Now, this doesn't necessarily affect when someone is in imminent danger to themselves or others from an emerging health condition or something like that. This is speaking to just these issues that are listed in the residential rights that CMS has listed.
So just to recap on everything Chris just said, the mandatory sections of a full HCBS policy would include a section of general rights, which cannot be modified, and expectations for person-centered planning. In addition to those two sections, if this is a provider-owned residential setting, we are also looking for your residential specific rights and a process for modification of these rights. That is a full HCBS policy.
Well, and we're also asking that you include a statement of individual training for the staff, annual training for the staff, and as well as a disclosure to the individuals. That could be in other policies, but you need to identify where those are. We're saying it's easiest to just include them on the HCBS policy since they're two simple statements at the end of the policy that states all staff working in HCBS settings, and it's on the example, will receive training annually. And all individuals receiving supports in HCBS settings will review their rights annually. So it's easiest if it's on the policy, but if it's somewhere else, as long as you're telling us where it is and you're including that, so if that's your staff development policy where you have it spelled out and it identifies HCBS, that's acceptable, but you need to give us that evidence and tell us that's where that's found. But in our view, it's easiest to encapsulate this all in one policy.
Also, we're just going to stop right now, and we want to encourage you all to visit the DMAS website if you have not done so already to check out the HCBS Toolkit. We've included the link here. You can also go to the general DMAS website, which is just dmas.virginia.gov, and type in HCBS in the search bar, which is in the upper right-hand corner. There's a ton of information on this toolkit, including a sample community participation policy and a sample full and compliant HCBS policy.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, team. You did a great job. Christopher, oh, we're not done yet? I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm trying to get to the questions and answers.
So the next section that we were going to cover is actually question 1 of REDCap. We went a little bit out of order because of the importance of your HCBS policy. So your HCBS policy in REDCap is technically question 2. So we wanted to cover that first, but now we're going to move back to question 1, which is community inclusion. So the second trend from the 1.3 reviews was a lack of individualized community inclusion practices. A provider using group community inclusion activities is not disallowed, and CMS does acknowledge that some group activities can be beneficial and appropriate. However, a provider cannot only provide group activities without the option for an individual to participate in an activity by themselves. This is person-centered planning in action. It is required for full HCBS compliance. As an agency, you are encouraged but not required to develop a community participation policy. There's a sample on the toolkit, which is partly pictured here on your screen. Your agency needs to outline how community inclusion is incorporated into your values as an agency. How do individuals explore community events that they are interested in? How is staff facilitating meaningful interactions in the community? How are we moving away from a groupthink mentality towards an individual choice attitude? The companion document listed here also shows several forms of acceptable evidence. We recommend referencing those when you're completing your 1.4. Moving on to question 3, we're going to talk about individual disclosures. As a provider, you are responsible to disclose HCBS rights to individuals in your program. This should be completed when an individual enters your program and annually thereafter. As you know, in REDCap, we are looking for a copy of your disclosure form. There's a sample picture here that came directly from the HCBS Toolkit, which is perfectly acceptable to adopt to your agency and use, and an attestation to confirm that you have fulfilled your obligations as a provider. However, to be in compliance for this question, you have to be disclosing an HCBS policy, not a human rights policy. So if you have not developed a full and compliant policy, you have been unable to disclose the proper rights to your individuals. We included a picture here of the sample disclosure form, and as well as the companion document that outlines everything that we're looking for in an attestation letter that can be submitted through REDCap. This is a 2 evidence question. Is there anything you'd like to add, Chris?
Just on one thing I'll say on the individual disclosure forms, people are adopting the forms in the toolkit. That's great. But you shouldn't leave that little logo up at the top that says HCBS Toolkit. It should be customized to your agency with your specific agency information. So we're still seeing that where people are just grabbing that and saying this is our disclosure form, but it's not. That's DMAS's disclosure form that was put up as an example. So, and that goes across the board for the policy or any of the forms that are put up there for your use. They're for your use, but they're expected that you will sanitize them of any of that place card holder information.
Next, we're going to move on to staff training and disclosures. So as a provider, you are responsible for training all staff and volunteers on HCBS rights. This should be completed at staff orientation and annually thereafter. These are reflected in question 4 and 5 in REDCap. As a provider, you must be training based on a compliant policy. Again, if you submitted an attestation based on a non-compliant policy, it's not valid and will have to be redone based on a new and compliant policy. To gain the compliant label, your agency must submit a signed and dated attestation letter to evidence that as of such and such date, all staff in HCBS settings have received rights trainings for all individuals. You must also submit a sign-in sheet from the training. This is a 2 evidence question. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Chris?
No, I just want to reinforce the fact that it's signed and dated. The attestation letters are signed and dated, and you have to put your MPI number on there. You don't necessarily have to tell us the number of staff trained, but it should state, as of this date, all staff in HCBS settings have received HCBS rights and responsibilities training or something to that effect. So don't leave out that date that states all staff have been trained as of this date.
That covers the specific trends that we've seen for 1.3 in REDCap. We hope that you have found this helpful and found where you can get your specific remediation from the toolkit. So we're going to move on now to what happens for providers who are unable to come into HCBS compliance. We're in the midst of a major system change. We're changing what has been the norm in service delivery for over 20 years and adopting a new individualized approach. HCBS rights of individuals are federal regulations that the state must comply with and assure that all providers are in compliance as well. It is the provider's responsibility to learn, understand, and implement in all of their settings HCBS rights of an individual receiving services. The state can provide tools, resources, and technical assistance to support providers with understanding the HCBS settings rules, but it is the provider's responsibility to use those resources and participate in the compliance process. It is concerning that we have been going through this process for over 2 years and still organizational compliance has not been met. It is critically important that you act now to come into provider organizational compliance. Should you fail to make policy and philosophy changes, there could be significant impacts to your status as a Medicaid provider. Your billing may stop. You may lose your provider agreement for HCBS services, and you may even be moved from the Medicaid network. Because as a state, we are required to comply with all federal regulations. Our agency intends to be fully transparent in this process, and while this information may be intimidating to hear, our agency and DBHDS are available to help all providers through this process. In the spirit of full transparency, we feel letting you know all of the possible consequences was necessary on the part of DMAS. We hope that understanding the possible outcomes can help providers communicate back system change to their agency staff and stakeholders. Now that you are fully aware of the importance of meeting provider organizational compliance, we'll conclude by talking about the next steps for HCBS. DMAS has acquired an outside consultant to assist us with mapping and planning for the over 2,900 specific setting validations that must be completed. We are beginning this phase now for providers who have already met organizational compliance. Again, this is why it's critical your organizations meet the provider level compliance now. These validations will be done by a review team developed cross-agency with DBHDS and DMAS. We will be conducting on-site reviews, interviews with people receiving services, and in-depth desk audits of every HCBS setting in Virginia. So embedding HCBS philosophy into your daily practice to show your commitment to this system change is vital. This is not going away. This is a living policy change, and this is not a policy change that could be filed and forgotten about. This is a change in everyday practice. For the last time today, I want to implore you all to take a look at the HCBS Toolkit available on the DMAS website if you have not already. There is a wealth of information on the toolkit. There is sample policies available for a full and compliant HCBS policy, disclosure forms, community participation policy. There's a companion guide that outlines what is accessible evidence for every single question in the REDCap assessment. There is a wealth of information on the toolkit. And if you have not done so already, for the last time today, I'm going to implore you to check it out. Chris and I will now take any questions that have been entered into the chat box.
All right. Thank you so much. It looks like the first question is, someone wanted to know what was the email address for questions after today's session.
Sure, that's a great question. So if you guys have any remaining questions after today, please feel free to email the HCBS comments email, which is HCBS comments with an S at dmass.virginiaspelledout.gov.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie. The next question is, bear with me here. If a supportive home provider only, are we required to complete this process? If we are supportive in-home provider only, are we required to complete this process? We discontinued sponsors in May of 2019.
Sure, so that's a great question. For the HCBS settings rule, in-home only providers is not a service that falls under the HCBS settings rule. So if you received the email about today's training, it's probably because REDCap filtered this service that you discontinued providing.
Thank you, Katie. The next question regarding locks on doors. Individuals who have severe medical conditions are total care, can that be a justification not to have locks on doors?
So I'm going to let Chris answer this.
No. The ability to use the lock is not what CMS is saying. CMS is saying the doors have the ability to be locked by the individual. So during the audit process, we will fully expect that all doors will have a door that is capable of locking. And having that individual activate that lock, whether it's electronically or by key, that is a requirement of this standard.
All right, thank you, Christopher. Next question. We provide employment for individuals in a community-based, fully integrated, natural employment setting. What does HCBS want us to say about the individual's assets to the community while they are at work?
So that's great. So group-supported employment is not something that we touched on today, super in-depth, so I'm so glad somebody asked this question. What HCBS is looking for group-supported employment settings is how folks are interacting with their colleagues who do not have disabilities, how are folks hanging out in the break room, who are we taking breaks with, are people making meaningful connections at work, like you or I would, with our colleagues at work. And I'm going to ask Chris if he has anything else to add.
Yeah, well, I'll just, coming from that background, I guess I can speak to this a bit. So a common model for group support employment would be landscaping. So we go out with a crew of 8 people, we do landscaping. Are those individuals, are they communicating with people at the 7-Eleven down the street when you go to lunch? Or are they communicating with the people at the residences? Are they having that type of relationship that you, as a non-disabled person, if you were a landscaper, might have? Are they becoming part of that? Or are they being restricted in some way that says, well, we're bringing you on to mow grass or do this, you're not to have interactions with people or these types of things? We expect that they would be allowed the natural opportunities of anyone working in those trades, whatever they may be. The settings piece is probably the easiest piece for us to verify, because it's very clear if there's a, an enclave working at a factory with 500 people, and those 8 people are in that same room, it's clear to see the setting. It's less clear to see, do they just go to the same lunchroom? Do they go to a separate area? Are they completely restricted in their interactions? So that's the level that employment is going to be looking for when they go out to actually interview. They'll be talking to the individuals and saying, hey, when you go to lunch, do you ever go to lunch with anyone that works here? Do you use the same lunchroom? Do you go at the same time as the rest of the people that work here? Have you developed any relationships with people that work here that go on after work? So those are the types of questions that will be asked. So just saying that a setting is fully integrated, it sounds good, but in practice, the reality is many people who've worked in the industry have seen it a different way. So.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And to follow up with that question, for day support, does the HCBS policy on the toolkit capture the modification required, or is it okay to copy and paste the policy as it exists there?
Okay, so great question. So the modification section of the toolkit, or of the HCBS policy on the toolkit, is specific to residential-owned settings. So in a day program, there are no specific modifications because people don't have a bedroom at a day support that would have a lock on the door. So what we're looking for is really an emphasis on how folks are interacting in the community, building relationships, demonstrating choice, self-directing their day, picking the activities they want to participate in that day. It's not, the specific residential modifications do not have to be included on a day support provider's policy.
So I'm not sure if you guys can follow this one, but next question is, when is the deadline for this to be completed?
So the 1.4 is in REDCap as of right now. You could begin the process today. I'm going to be completely transparent. We do not know when we're going to shut it down to begin reviews. It just kind of depends on how much training and support people still need, because we want to be supportive of every provider to give them an opportunity to come into full compliance.
I will say at this point, if you've been participating in you did the review, you did the 1.2, you did the 1.3, as you move along, you don't need to revisit any of those things that we've already looked at and have found them to be, so when you get to 1.4, you merely want to look at the comments in Part 5 and address only the issues we say are missing. You don't need to reload all the evidence from all the other sections. So if you get there and it says you forgot to do an attestation letter, we need to know that 100% of individuals have received this disclosure as of what date. That's all you need to put in there. That's all you need to upload is that and say, here's the attestation letter. It represents 100% of our people in HCBS settings, and you're done.
So they want to know they need to upload a signed copy of the attestation letter for it.
Yes, you have to upload the signed copy. You can digitally sign it. Some people are digitally signing their forms, but it does have to have the name and title of an individual that's saying that has been accomplished.
All right. Thank you, Chris. How is allowing guests to have visitors any time of day or night, not an infringement on the other individuals living in their household?
This is a tricky question to answer. I guess what CMS would say is you need to look at it if it does become a problem, if it does infringe upon other people's happiness, and you can demonstrate that, you have evidence of that, then you may be able to have an exception to that for that individual or that guest. So if a guest comes into the home and they're popping their head in and out of everyone else's room or waking people up in the middle of the night, then that's addressed on a case-by-case basis. But what we're speaking to here today is a policy. Your policy needs to state that that's their right, They have the right to visitors at any time. And then as things come up and that process is tried in your settings and it's not working, you can't change the policy. You have to identify what individuals it's not working for and then address that through the exceptions rules that are placed in the policy as well.
All right, Chris, thank you. So where do you go back in the system and enter the data requested in areas where they indicated partial compliance?
Okay, well, I think I already answered that. But yeah, when you go into 1.4, some of you out there may have received an email from me that said you're real close to compliance. 1.3 will remain open for a bit, about another maybe week. So you can put that information in 1.3 or 1.4 at this point. It doesn't matter. The Section 5 always remains the same. So you address just the items in the Section 5. You upload them in each of the areas. So if it's the attestation, that deals with questions in the Section 5. That's questions 2 and 3. If it's the staff training, that's question 4. That's where we look for those. But really, if you put it anywhere in there and it clearly is labeled attestation letter for staff training, we're going to see it, we'll find it, we'll check it off. So don't worry so much about where you're putting things. Just make sure that when you're using your comment section that the comments apply to the question at the top of that section.
Yeah, so I'm just going to add one thing to what Chris said. I've been getting into the HCBS email box some emails from providers that are saying, oh, I got deemed non-compliant, but here's my policy, and they're attaching it in an email to HCBS email box. So we can't accept those. All of your documentation needs to be housed in REDCap, and REDCap is where you're going to find your organizational compliance label when you reach organizational compliance. So if you were a provider who submitted something in the email box, anything you submitted as a way to show your compliance needs to be in REDCap.
Yeah, there's a nuts and bolts reason for this. REDCap is where, so when this is all said and done and we turn in our final results to CMS and ask them to sign off on our sign off on our HCBS compliance for the state, we need to have a place where all of that evidence is, because CMS could come back and say, that's great, but we need you to provide us with 100 providers information so that we can review that to ensure that your view of compliance is the same. We're not sure that's going to happen, but no states have come into full compliance yet, so we're not really sure where this is going. So that's the portal where all that information is going to remain. It's not being printed out and put in some file cabinet here at DMAS. It's staying right there in REDCap, and that's where it'll be used.
All right, so under community life is the HCBS Toolkit red flag. Can you address how community employers can address these?
I'm not sure I understood that question, so I would ask whoever that was to go ahead and shoot an email to hcbscomments@dmas.virginia.gov, and we can try to figure out one-on-one.
Great. The next question. I may have missed this information, but what is the date that providers have to come fully compliant or we lose our Medicaid provider agreement?
So there's not a specific date that's been identified because, again, we plan on working with providers to raise to provider organizational compliance. You know, it is not our goal to put anybody's provider participation in jeopardy. It is certainly not our goal if an individual has selected your service for an individual to then have to find a different service provider. That is not our goal. So we intend to help providers come into full compliance. The only deadline specifically I can give you is that all states must be in full compliance by March 17th of 2022.
Yeah, I want to speak to that a little because I'm going to ask any of you that are out there that understand how this system works. If you begin to reverse calendar yourself, reverse engineer from March 17th, understand that individuals at some point will be given a choice. to either remain with providers that don't come into compliance or work with the CRCs to be given another provider. That is a very timely process. It also should be very clear, we're going to be fully transparent, is that if at any time Department of Behavioral Health or DMAS feel that providers just are not participating in this process, at any time DMAS can initiate that process of saying, you know what, no effort's been made, we may need to move this to another level, to a different level with this provider. And that's just the realities of this system. If we lose providers through this because they choose not to fall into what's required, it's better for the system to know that as early in the process as possible, because all those individuals probably are not going to want to give up their waiver funding. They're probably going to want to move that service somewhere else. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, but we do know that it is not easy to place hundreds of people in a provider network that's maybe saturated in certain areas where there's no bed space, there's no day program space. So working with people is going to be a time-consuming process.
So Kathy also just let me know that there were a couple of people saying they wanted to know how to get in contact with direct people. So I once again want to put out that the best point of contact for any HCBS question is the HCBS email box. That is, again, for a specific reason, because we want to have all of our emails stored in one place to easily find them. So it's hcbscomments@dmas.virginia.gov. I personally man that email box, and it's just me, so it might take me some time to get back to you, but I will. And if your question requires more help than I just have time to be able to support you with that, we've partnered with DBHDS, with Chris and his review team, as well as the CRCs, and we will get somebody back in touch with you.
Thank you so much. Regarding the staff training, if you have to retrain with update policies, do you use the current date when we started the process?
All right, so I think this must be speaking to people that placed evidence in there saying, yeah, we completed staff training, but they didn't have a compliant HCBS policy. So if you received a comment from myself or one of the other reviewers that states your policy did not have enough of the elements to be considered compliant, therefore the staff training and the disclosures you did are invalid and will need to be repeated, then yes, that entire policy has to be in place, and then you would review that policy. Your policy should, with staff training, that should be part of your staff training process. You shouldn't dilute that for them. They need to understand that that's a policy, that's and having that up on the screen and saying, this is our policy, let's go through each of these sections and explain how that fits into our settings. Now, if you receive a comment back saying you're partially compliant, that there are some missing elements from your policy, and you fix that policy, then really all you need to do is review those elements and post in the comments section that we fixed our policy, added the expectations section, and discussed those exceptions section with our staff so that they understand the process for how exceptions roll out. But then annually thereafter, that new policy is what you're reviewing with the staff. So use the comments that we put in the Section 5. They're usually very specific. And if you get a general one that you're not sure how to take an action on, then just shoot the HCBS email box a question saying, this question's not specific enough, because we did at one point have a lot of reviewers looking at this, and we've narrowed down to 2. So we're getting a little more consistent now, but some of you may still have comments in there that don't really give you a whole lot of direction. But we'll get you the help you need.
Great. Next question. If a guardian requests that an individual does not have keys to their room, is documentation so acceptable under the HCBS rules? HCBS rules.
You done?
Okay, so if a guardian requests the individual does not have a key to their room, is documentation stating so acceptable under the HCBS rules?
So I think it's important to remember here, that's a great question, that when we're talking about your development of a policy, we're talking about your overarching agency policy. So your overarching agency policy, if you're a residential provider, must include that doors have locks on them with keys, or, you know, a swipe pad or, you know, like whatever, for a key for privacy. Now, if a guardian has requested to modify that right, that would fall under the modification section, but it would not be a blanket policy change. Great question.
Wonderful. Where is the attestation form? I guess they mean online.
I don't believe that there is a sample attestation form online, but there is on the companion guide for 1.2 that I pointed to earlier. It outlines all of the very specific requirements of an attestation form that can be accepted, which is like the date it was written, your NPI number, the date and the title of training.
Yeah, so if you're a provider that has multiple NPIs and you're sending in one letter for, you're going to encapsulate all of your settings, then include all of those NPI numbers on that letter that states, okay, the following NPI numbers, all staff have received training in HCBS Settings, Rules, and Requirements as of this date, and then it's signed either electronically or actually signed and scanned and sent in and dated by the person who's certifying that. Now, that person that's doing that should be someone at the director or ownership level. It shouldn't be, you know, one group home manager from one group home. It should coincide with whoever's in our contact list in HCBS should probably be the person that's initiating that process. In those cases, it's been either a division director or the owner of the actual facility.
Great. So should the attestation letter be uploaded for each consumer served in a day support setting, or in one signed attestation letter example sufficient? So we serve 16 consumers and want to clarify if you need to see each one, or would the settings review capture that information?
Okay, so I think we've crossed over from attestation to disclosure. So an attestation letter is something we're providing as, now there's other ways you can meet this requirement of evidence. So the attestation letter is just an easy way for the provider to say, I have 123 people who receive services in HCBS settings, and as of April 1st, 2020, they've all received disclosure of their rights and signed an acknowledgement form, signed and dated. Sounds to me like we're crossing over into disclosure. If you have 15 people in your program and you don't want to do the attestation letter, you can send us 15 disclosure forms showing that that's been done, and you can put in the comment section, there are 15 disclosure forms attached. This represents 100% of people in HCBS settings. We need to see that 100%.
So also I'm just going to add very quickly that the disclosure form, you can submit an attestation saying, you know, we have 15 folks and we've trained our 15 folks and it's signed and dated, but we want to see your agency's disclosure form. We showed you a sample today that was taken directly from the toolkit. Your agency does need a disclosure form, and whatever disclosure form you all come up with, should it not be the one taken from the toolkit, does need to be uploaded in REDCap for review. So it is a two evidence question.
And it needs to state HCBS rights on the disclosure.
So there was another comment that came in that I just want to address about speaking to somebody personally. Again, please reach out to the HCBS comment email box, and if we'll get back to you. If it's not myself or Chris, we also have some support from the CRC staff who are assigned to help you with their new assignments for HCBS, and somebody will get back to you.
Okay. So if we incorporate the HCBS in the policy and procedure, do we just upload the whole policy or just the sections that were updated? So if we incorporate the HCBS in the policy and procedures, do we just upload the whole policy or just the sections that were updated?
So I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but I'm gonna take my best guess at it. If you were deemed partially compliant because your policy was missing a section, it was missing the ISP section or modification of rights if you're a residential provider, once you've made your adjustment, we would ask that you resubmit your entire policy.
Yeah, and if you're rolling, what I spoke to earlier, if you're adding HCBS rights to your human rights policy as a subsection, then we probably should have the human rights section, and then in the comments you would state HCBS rights found, page whatever. Since that's the whole document, we would need to see that. But no, we do not want to see your whole policy manual, just the HCBS piece of that.
All right, we got a couple of individuals that said they're trying to get to the toolkit, but the toolkit is saying they're getting an error message saying that your account has expired.
Sure. So that is actually a really common issue. I'm glad that we're actually going to get a chance to talk about it today. So that is linked to your agency or your computer's Adobe account. So we would recommend you take the steps to reach out. I think there's a part on that Adobe message that says, contact Adobe support. That would be the route you want to take for that. Thank you for the question.
All right. So we've reached the end of our time as well as the end of the question and answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay up for a little bit. So if you have additional questions, go ahead and send them in to the chat box. And what we'll do is we will respond by emailing the questions and answer back to everybody that is logged on to the webinar. We want to thank everyone for attending today's session. And
that's it. Thank you all very much for your attendance, and please feel free to get in contact with DMAS or DBHDS for more support, and we look forward to working with everybody to come into provider organizational compliance.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.